Pakistan is clearly emerging as an important channel between Washington and Tehran, with Field Marshal Asim Munir speaking to both sides as diplomatic efforts intensify. But the key question is, how is Tehran viewing these efforts? Iran has reportedly outlined conditions for negotiations while also stressing the importance of the Strait of Hormuz and previously agreed agreements and arrangements. So for the latest from Tehran, let's bring our correspondent Yusuf Jalali. Thank you, Yusuf, for joining me here tonight. Look, what is the latest from Tehran, and also how seriously is Iran taking Pakistan's diplomatic efforts to bring Washington and Tehran back to negotiating table?
Iranians have time and again thanked Pakistan, Islamabad, for trying to keep the diplomatic channels open. The Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi himself personally he thanked and appreciated what he called constructive efforts, diplomatic efforts by Pakistan, and of course by other countries like Oman and Egypt. These countries have been in constant contact with Iranian officials, trying to bridge the gap between Iran and the United States. But of course, major gaps remain between the two sides, and the Pakistani role here is very much important because Iran is now very much critical of the United States for what it calls violating some parts of the memorandum of understanding signed back in June in Islamabad. So now we see that Pakistani officials, including the army chief, Mr. Munir, visited Tehran on Monday. He held talks with senior Iranian officials, including the president, where Iran reportedly delivered and communicated messages through the Pakistani officials to the United States. This is very much important for the two sides to try to de-escalate and break this stalemate between Iran and the United States. But of course, as long as the United States ignores Iran's demands, including the sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz, and of course the removal of the oil-related sanctions, the secondary sanctions against Iran's front companies, and of course the so-called shadow fleet that tries to facilitate the export of Iran's oil. So these sanctions have to be removed. The naval blockade against Iranian ports have to be lifted before Iran goes back to the negotiating table. So while Islamabad's role here is very much important, if the United States keeps ignoring Iran's calls for these demands and these conditions, then we're not going to expect any diplomatic breakthrough at this stage.
Look, we just talked, you just mentioned Field Marshal Asim Munir, and Iranian officials here have reportedly described the discussions with him as highly fruitful. What exactly is Tehran expecting from Pakistan at this stage?
Well, Pakistan continues to play very important, as I said earlier. Iran calls it constructive. And of course, this back and forth between Tehran and Islamabad is very much significant at this very critical stage when there's no talk and no strike. So Iran says that it continues to keep the Strait of Hormuz closed. It continues to close the Strait of Hormuz. But at the same time, Iran is in touch with Oman, with the Omani side. The two sides have been in constant touch with each other. We also heard that Badr al-Busayri, the foreign minister of Oman, held very important discussions with his Iranian counterpart, Mr. Araghchi, on Tuesday. The two sides achieved a temporary solution to the traffic of vessels from the Strait of Hormuz. That was as elaborated and expounded on by the Deputy Foreign Minister of Iran, Mr. Kazem Gharibabadi, who said that the Iranians and the Omanis have reached an agreement to open some part of the Strait of Hormuz. They would allow vessels to enter the Persian Gulf through the Iranian track, the northern track of the Persian Gulf, and to partly exit the Strait of Hormuz through the Omani track. So this is very much important, and the Iranians and the Omanis have expressed hope that this temporary solution would turn into a permanent solution. But any meaningful reopening of the Strait of Hormuz still is contingent upon the Americans to acknowledge Iran's sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz, and of course to lift their economic pressure on Iran, including the naval blockade and the removal of the sanctions.
Well, you just mentioned also the conditions. Let's talk about them. Iran has reportedly outlined conditions for negotiations, particularly regarding the Strait of Hormuz. What are the key conditions Tehran wants Washington to meet before talks can move forward? Can you zoom into this, please?
Mm-hmm. Well, Iran has made it clear on different occasions that the United States, first of all, needs to lift the naval blockade. We do know that the United States has blockaded Iran's ports in south of the country, and this blockade needs to be lifted before Iran goes back to the negotiating table. And of course, there are other conditions, including the releasing of Iran's foreign assets, so unfreezing Iran's foreign assets. This is another condition. And what's significant is that Iran expects Washington to also lift the oil-related sanctions. But what we're seeing happening in Washington is that the Treasury Department has even ramped up the pressure on Iran's oil. They've not just lifted the sanctions, but they've mounted the pressure on the Iranian oil. And we do know that Iran is an oil-rich country and is very much dependent on oil revenues. The oil revenue represented the lifeline of Iran's economy. So the Iranians are not seeing any signal, any positive or constructive signal on the part of the United States. And as long as this behavior continues, both sides are waiting for the other side to cave or to crack or to blink before they go back to the negotiating table. Iran is saying that the United States has to abandon this behavior. They have to show that they could be trusted in any forthcoming negotiations. And as long as the United States keeps mounting the pressure on Tehran, then we're not expecting any breakthrough or any resumption of talks at this stage, at least.
Okay, so before I let you go, a last question is, if both countries would agree on ceasefire, would Tehran be prepared to reopen the waterway as part of a broader agreement with Washington?
That's a yes, because based on comments by some Iranian officials, including Mr. Arakchi made it clear that if the United States acts first, if it shows that it could be trusted in any talks, then Iran is ready to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. But any meaningful reopening of the strait, any return to pre-crisis levels of the shipment of energy from the Persian Gulf, from the Strait of Hormuz to the rest of the world, depends on the United States removing all the pressure on Iran and complying with or accepting at least Iran's demands. And those demands, as I was highlighting, include the ending of hostilities on all fronts, not just on Iran, but also on Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis around Ansarullah in Yemen, and the Hashd al-Shaabi or Popular Mobilization Force in Iraq. If all these demands are met, then we can expect that Iran would reopen the Strait of Hormuz and the shipment of oil would return to pre-crisis level.
All right. Thank you so much for your time. I appreciate you being here in World Tonight.